Okay, so we're back again. Here's the second lecture on preference assessments, and during lecture number 2, which is going to be a little longer than lecture 1 was, we're going to talk about systematic preference assessments. And this is where we're going to go through all the sort of details from the various articles that you read. Now, I'm going to cover some of the articles you read, not necessarily all of them. I may even throw in a few that you didn't read and refer to those. You will not be held accountable for anything that I sort of bring up during this lecture that was not on your reading list. So understand that you're only responsible for what's on your reading list. So this lecture is again about systematic preference assessments. The first thing is just to sort of lay them out in a table form. The main 5 articles that you need to pay attention to as far as systematic preference methodology begins with the article by Gary Pace and his colleagues in 1985. Fisher, De Leon, and Iwata, or De Leon is better known as Willie by all of his friends and colleagues. Ronan in 1998, and then De Leon again in 1999. And it goes through stimulus presentation of single stimulus in trials, paired stimulus in trials, group stimuli in trials, group-free operant, which is one of my favorite ones, and then single stimulus again in trials. So we're going to be measuring things like the percentage of approach, the percentage of selection, the duration of engagement are sort of the 3 major dependent variables. There I go using that lingo, dependent variables. That is the thing you measure, like rate or percent of intervals that you're going to measure in order to determine whether or not the stimuli are actually preferred by the individual. So direct observation of approach, Pace, Gary Pace, who by the way lives down on Cape Cod and worked for the May Institute, excuse me, for many, many years, and was a colleague of mine at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and the Kennedy Institute back in the late 70s and early 80s. This direct observation approach, direct observation in the individual's natural setting. Items are present during free play. Data is recorded on approach to items, self-selection and duration of use. And then basically what you do is you move things around, not to try to trick the kid, but just so that if he has a preference for things to the left or things to the right or things just directly in front of him and he doesn't pay attention to things still on one side or the other, then you can sort of balance that out and make sure you're not getting a false impression that he likes something, and then you go find out later that the only reason he liked that one thing is because he only paid attention to things in front of him. So that's sort of what Gary did. That was a very early article in the whole area of preference assessment, and I think that it was really sort of a foundational article that helped us move along through an entire list of different ones. Choice assessment was begun in an article initially described by Fisher in 1992. Stimuli were presented and paired with every other stimulus. They were placed just a little over half a meter apart and about a half a meter in front of the kid. An instruction was given to the kid that you could only pick one. What do you want? Pick one. What would you like to play with? And the kid's approach, 5 seconds of access to the choice. When they approached it, simultaneous approach was blocked. So if you reached for both at one time, you sort of blocked them and said, no, you can only have one. And no response, you sort of gave a sampling to the kid of each of the different 2 items. So the 3 options were, if he picked one item, he gets to play with it for 5 seconds, and then you try again. If he doesn't do anything, you kind of give him one, and then you give him the other, and try to get them to experience the 2. And if he tries to go for both at the same time, you block that. So that's basically what Fisher did in 1992. In comparison to single choice presentations and paired choice presentations, the paired choice are much more reliable identifiers of reinforcement. So if you're just giving them one thing to play with, one at a time, and see whether they take it or don't take it, whether they engage with it, that's not a very good predictor. You need to give them access to at least 2 things, or maybe like Gary Pace did, more than 2 things. And then just make sure they're engaging with everything, that they've experienced everything, and then take some data on which one they spend more time with. A summary of the methods: single subjects, paired stimulus, and then the very last one, we look at advantages, disadvantages, and single stimulus is much more efficient, identifies many reinforcers. The advantages of the paired stimulus is more distinct rankings than single stimulus and identifies most potential reinforcers. And you can see sort of the rest of the stuff there as far as the results from these kinds of interventions or these kinds of assessments. PACE, Ivancy, Edwards, Iwata, and Page. You do see that name Iwata a lot, don't you? And you'll see Terry Page's name in there, who was a colleague of ours and another faculty member at Johns Hopkins. This article was published in JABA in 1985. The purpose was to demonstrate two-stage method for identifying reinforcer. First was an assessment of stimulus preference, and then an evaluation of the reinforcer effectiveness. So they sort of took it through both of them. In a classroom, as a teacher, it's going to be hard enough for you or as the consultant to a teacher to get the teacher to actually do a preference assessment, which I feel is just as critical as an FBA. Doing a reinforcer assessment requires so much more time, even beyond the preference assessment, that it's probably not something you're really going to have a lot of experience doing unless you're consulting in a case where the kid is engaging in very significant self-injurious, aggressive kinds of behaviors. And you really need to be careful that you make sure you have good, solid reinforcers for your behavior plan. So there's several studies here. Study 1 was a preference assessment. There were 6 subjects. All were profoundly mentally retarded. The stimuli, there were 16 total stimuli in 8 different stimulus classes, which were visual, auditory, olfactory. In other words, all the different sensory modalities. I thought thermal was kind of cool because you could have things that are cold, things that are warm. Stimulus groupings, there were 20 trials per session, 4 stimuli, 5 times each, counterbalanced, meaning that we sort of made sure everything was paired with everything else. 16 stimuli times 10 presentations, so there's 160 trials over 20, which comes out to about 8 sessions, or comes out exactly to 8 sessions. Trial presentation in the single stimulus format approach for 5 seconds, and they get 5 seconds of access, which is the same, if you remember, as what was the Fisher article that we just talked about. And then no response, they removed the stimuli, prompt sampling, repeated the trial. The results were very idiosyncratic preferences. Some people liked one thing, some people liked others. All participants' approach was greater than 80% and less than 20% for at least one stimulus. So they were seeing highly discriminable responding between one set of stimuli or one stimulus and something else, and they were actually able to get reasonably good results showing that there were high preferences for some things and low preferences for others. Study 2 was a reinforcer assessment. The response measurement, the response was varied. They were looking for reach, looked, raise hand, touch hand, and say the word eat. So they were taking objective behaviors and measuring those behaviors in relation to the stimuli. 10 trials per session, verbal prompt on each trial. So, for example, if it's say eat, they would say to the individual who is profoundly retarded, say eat. And if they did, then they would deliver the reinforcer. During baseline, there was a prompt only with no consequence. During the preferred condition, which is a condition where the things that individual identified as preferred would be used as a reinforcer, they got 5 seconds access to the stimulus. And then the non-preferred, where they used less preferred items from the preference assessment, they got 5 seconds access to the stimulus. They used a reversal design, and the results were the percent correct responding and percent correct response for preferred versus non-preferred. Note the exception for Mick with hugs. Apparently Mick didn't test out quite the way they wanted him to. So basically what they're saying here, the advantage is the empirical assessment of preference and reinforcer effect simplicity. It's very simple and it can accommodate a wide range of stimuli. What were the limitations on this study? Takes a long time. Not going to get a teacher to do it. Not going to be able to run this in a situation where you've got 10 or 15 or 20 kids in a classroom. Preference assessment is basically the way to go. Fisher, Piazza, Bauman, and Hagopian, Owens, and Selvin, 1992. They wanted to compare single stimulus preference assessment and paired stimulus. Single stimulus method may be prone to false positives, which we know is one of the potential disadvantages, but we also know that the paired stimulus method may yield more differentiated outcomes. So if you're only showing them one thing at a time, they may play with things that they really don't eventually or won't eventually work for as a reinforcer. Where the paired stimulus, if there's two things or three things or multiple things, the chances are I'm going to pick the one out of that array that I really like, and there's a much higher probability that that's going to serve as a reinforcer. So they had 4 subjects. They were severely or profoundly mentally retarded. There were 16 stimuli, exactly the same thing as in the PACE study. The single stimulus procedure was that each stimulus was presented singularly, 10 times each. Approach was given 5 seconds access, no response, prompt and repeat the trial, just like we've seen before. The paired stimulus, each stimulus paired with every other stimulus. If they selected it, they got 5 seconds access, and the removal of the unselected item. So that distractor sort of thing. And the results was that single stimulus, some subjects showed uniformly high approach. So sometimes they would only reach out and play with the thing that they really liked, where others, they'd show you something else that you didn't particularly like, you wouldn't reach out to play with. But the paired stimulus, there was much greater differentiation in approach. Why guaranteed outcome? Exactly what I've been saying. If there's 2 things there and I like one and I don't like the other, or I like one more than I like the other one, the chances are I'm going to reach for that one, and you're going to get a rank order if you compare them, and you're going to know what is the highest preferred item, the next highest preferred. You can rank order because you're comparing one thing to the other and everything else, and you'll know in relation to, with those 16 items, I like this one better, I like hugs better than I like broccoli. I keep going back to broccoli. Study 2, they did a reinforcer assessment, basically did a lot of the same things as the other one. And there was, the conclusion was a single subject method produced a lot of false positives exactly what we talked about before, and exactly what we said from the beginning, is that single stimulus preference assessment is better than no preference assessment. But if you're going to do a preference assessment, do a paired stimulus preference assessment. Eileen Roscoe, Brian Owada, and Sunwoo Khan published an article in 1999. That article was to compare single stimulus and paired stimulus preference procedure under single and concurrent schedules of reinforcement. You studied concurrent schedules of reinforcement during the research methods class. Concurrent procedures may mask reinforcing effects of a less preferred stimuli because you've got to choose one over the other. And remember the matching law. You're not just going to go for the same one every single time, even though it's more preferred. You're going to go for them in a probability of which one you like more. So if I like this one twice as much as I like that one, I'm still going to pick this one, but I'm going to pick it half as often as I pick that one over there. So that's why the procedure is going to demonstrate the relative reinforcing value of one over the other. 8 participants, moderate to profoundly retarded, 10 different food items. Both of the 2 procedures the same as in the PACE and then Fisher articles. The results were the single stimulus. All subjects showed uniformly high approach, with the exception of Jim. So basically all 10 food items they were going after, but in the paired stimulus, they got greater differentiation. So once again, more data to support the use of a paired stimulus preference assessment. Study 2, there's switch, and we're going to look at responses per minute as a response. And basically what they came out with for conclusions in this study, that the concurrent schedule masked the reinforcer effect of low probability, high single stimulus preference assessment items. The single subject method better suited for identifying many reinforcers, but the paired stimulus better suited for identifying more potent reinforcers. Again, paired stimulus. So some future questions that we need to think about from that one. Examine the data. Go back and look at that article. Go back and look at Fisher et al. Figure 2 and Mike in Eileen Roscoe's study. Look at those two and see if you can come up with some questions in those two graphs that might make you think a little bit about what we should do. Another question for future consideration is how stable are preferences over time? There was an article published in 2001 that if they're unstable, what are the determinants of preference? Is time irrelevant? I think there's all sorts of determinants of preference. I mean, if there's one thing I've been told by teachers for my entire 35 years of my career is that every time they do a preference assessment on Bobby's preferences change either within the day or the week, and that they have to keep going back and say, oh, well, of course they do. Think about the term establishing operations. Think about the term abolishing operations. Think about if Bobby, some days he likes reinforcers that are edible, and some days he likes things that he can play with and chooses those. Maybe the difference is whether he has a really big breakfast before he comes to school that morning and he's not hungry. That's what establishing operations are all about. If he doesn't have a big breakfast, chances are he's going to work for something edible. If he has a big breakfast, chances are he won't. So think about that and think about potential applications of that, and maybe even a test question that has to do with that. Do deprivation and satiation affect preference on performance? That's exactly what I just got through talking about. A couple of articles that you might want to read about deprivation and satiation effects. How might one establish the reinforcing effects of non-preferred activities? Hanley, 2003. That's Greg Hanley from Western New England College. Talked about that in his article in 2003. How do we establish the reinforcing effect of a non-preferred activity? Fairly simply, let's make it a condition reinforcer. Let's pair it with a primary reinforcer and make it something that somebody's willing to work for. There might be other things that we could throw out that would be future questions that would go along with that. And then how might the efficiency of current methods be increased? At this point, I'm not sure there's a good answer to that one because there have literally been more than a book full of different studies done on how to run preference assessment. You replace the article, you don't replace the article, you do paired stimulus with replacement, paired stimulus without replacement. There's all sorts of options that you can do, and there's been research done on all of them. Frankly, the rate at which publications, since Pace's original article, the rate at which publications on preference assessments have been coming out in the literature has tapered off, and there's very few preference assessment studies being published anymore. And it was a very ripe field for a long time, not so much anymore. De Leon and Iwata, 1996, they published a study to compare multiple stimulus assessment procedure with and without replacement of the item that's selected. So basically what they mean by the replacement thing is if you put three things in front of me, a chocolate piece of candy, an orange piece of an orange, and a piece of a banana, and you say pick one, and I pick the chocolate candy. Well, the next time you come back around, do you put the chocolate candy back there? Do you switch positions and offer me the same ones again and replace the chocolate, or once I take the chocolate you don't replace it? So it's multiple stimulus with replacement, multiple stimulus without replacement. Different people have looked at different ways of doing it and come up with different conclusions. But basically what they say is multiple stimulus method more efficient than paired. because you're using more than one thing at the same time, and that paired stimulus method resulted in more distinct rankings. 16.7% of items never selected in a multiple stimulus method. I think there's pluses or minuses. Personally, I like paired stimulus better than single stimulus. I like multiple stimulus even better, especially when you're dealing with somebody whose cognitive function is maybe a little higher. If you start putting too many things in front of somebody who's profoundly retarded or even severely retarded, you may begin to confuse them, and they're not able to really attend to all the things that are there, and you sort of overwhelm them with too many potential highly preferred items. Study 1, the results in that study, 7 participants, 7 different stimuli. The results were a high degree of consistency for the highest ranked stimulus. This is multiple stimulus versus multiple stimulus without replacement. Multiple stimulus method, more unselected stimuli than multiple stimulus without replacement or paired stimulus. Rankings more similar and more consistent, and multiple stimulus and multiple stimulus without were more efficient than paired stimulus. So you can sort of see they came out with some nice clean results there. Of course, they published a second study within the article. At the same time, they do a reinforcer assessment, and they found that multiple stimulus without is more likely to identify reinforcers than multiple stimulus. There was a high failure rate of multiple stimulus, may be due to mixed classes of stimuli. The cutoff scores may not be comparable, and there were some limitations to the study that they talk about in their article. Now, here's another thing that I think is really pretty cool. Dan Cohen-Almeida, who is now Dan Almeida, or Dan Cohen. Anyway, Dan Cohen-Almeida, Rick Graff, and Bill Ahern in 2000, they were all at the New England Center, wrote an article where they compared tangible presentations of objects with a verbal presentation. Simply put, I show you an apple versus I say to you without showing you an apple, would you like an apple? And the question is, do I really need to assemble all these different items, or can I just ask you about them? Now, before we go through this article, let me just say from minute one, part of the outcome of that kind of comparison, no matter which way you think it's going to come out, is going to have to do with the receptive language skills of the individual that you're dealing with. So if you're dealing with somebody that's severely or profoundly retarded, you're going to have a lower probability that verbal presentation is going to work as good as the presentation of the actual object itself. Assessments using verbal presentation were completed in less time. Assessments using verbal and tangible presentations achieved in their study comparable results in 4 of the 6 subjects. But again, I think it has a lot to do with the cognitive functioning level of the individual. Verbal versus pictorial. Northrop and colleagues in 1996 confirmed that verbal choices were as effective as pictorial choices. So you can show somebody a picture of an apple versus using the word apple versus actually showing them the apple. It also confirmed that survey was less likely to correspond to the results of a reinforcer assessment than choice-based assessments. Well, we know that from 10 years ago, or 10 years before this article, but they just reconfirmed that. But now you've got multiple choices. You've got somebody that you can show a picture of something, you can tell them, or you can actually show them the object itself and do the preference assessment, not necessarily with having to come up with the object. And again, just like in the FBA studies, somebody wanted to decide, do you really have to do it and take such a long amount of time? So Ronan, Vollmer, Tim Vollmer, Ringdahl and Marcus in 1998 compared a 5-minute stimulus preference assessment involving non-contingent free access to an array of stimulus during a 5-minute session. And they compared results to a paired stimulus assessment, and the results were basically identifying reinforcers and required less time. So they were able to identify the reinforcer, took less time, much like the FBA study where we were able to get it down to taking less and less time and doing it much more efficiently than we had done it before. Ambiguous preference assessment, where in the world they come up with some of these ideas. Individual may or may not make a selection. If none of the items are preferred, if choice-making skills are lacking, or if several of the items are highly preferred and compete with each other and switch between items can become ambiguous. So that's, I wouldn't pay a whole lot of attention to that. So what to do? Present items singularly, although this method is less reliable. Do duration-based assessments with single items like Willie D. Leon said in 1999. Present items alone, measure duration, the subject manipulates them. That's certainly one of the things you can do. So, we've come to the end of lecture 2. I hope I didn't confuse you too much by going so quickly, but you can go back and watch this a couple of times. Now that you've read all of those articles, you can sort of get your head wrapped around how to do a systematic preference assessment, just like you do a systematic FBA. One is just as important as the other. If you're wanting to change someone's behavior, you need to make sure that the stimulus you're using contingent on that behavior is actually a reinforcer to even have a chance of being successful. I will talk to you again in a little bit, and we'll do lecture number 3.